Let's see, I should be on share screen.
Okay. It
Multiple
says host
participants.
disabled participant. So
There we go. Should be multiple participants can share
there we go.
simultaneously. There we go.
Yes, sir. All right, we should be good. So can you see that, Dr. Landon?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, so what we've discussed so far, obviously indicates there will be a broad spectrum of disparate sources of data. You've got geofencing, you've got measurements of behavior patterns, you've got biometrics and sensors, in addition to the standard electronic health records, labs, and other data that'll be relevant to the study. And one of the things that we're going to talk about here is, as we explore for a few moments today, the properties of distributed ledger technology. And just to take a moment, step back, the name itself is indicative here, right? Distributed ledger, right? So the DLT, or in layperson's terms, blockchain, which has negative connotations, we'll stay with the real terminology here, just to stay centered on that. But the key is distributed or decentralized, right? It is against the norm of what happens today, in my experience, and perhaps in the experience of those on this call today, where the idea is to centralize the data, pull it all together, and then do some analytics. Indeed, DLT allows you to integrate at a high fidelity level, like very granular level, data from these disparate sources, and then utilize that where the data are created, right? Centralization is costly for a lot of reasons. Architecturally and software-wise, we can go into that in detail, but from a compute and a network perspective, a time latency, all those costs add up. It's also very inefficient for artificial intelligence and other modeling training exercises when it comes to data science. So we find that the DLT can be very effective in situations such as this. We also hear so far that there's, you've got CF clinics and other outpatient facilities, or inpatient, if in some cases. You've got, some other, lung transplant operations and so on, that may or may not require further incentivization. So to incentivize opportunities, the DLT offers us some very unique ways. We're going to get into that very high level today. We can drill in if it's of interest to the participants to drive their respective studies and then the overall objective for the campaign here. But there's an opportunity here for us to consider restructuring research operations across the enterprise, utilizing this global macro project, if you will, to do so for specific outcomes. Finally, we'll find that as we drill down into it, that DLT is also sort of a fundamental substrate and allows us to assure the elimination, or at least identify such, bias, if you will, in the data, which allows us to assure ethical construct. And it also invokes highly sensitive, highly protective, in fact, in many cases, immutable privacy measures, which may go back to that incentivization model here for organizations to share the data. The picture in the center, the illustration in the center of the slide here, is taken from a document or a chapter, if you will. I had the good fortune of collaborating with Dr. Landon last year. He and I co-authored a chapter of a book on the use of DLT in the ICU, right? So in effect, aiding the intensivist's experience and the ability to respond in the moment. So the cartoon itself here just sort of is an extrapolation of that chapter. I believe Dr. Landon has, not in a self-serving way, but certainly I think he's already circulated the chapter or the pre-write. It's going to be published in June of this year as part of a larger textbook, actually. The diagram actually is a good illustration summarizing the effects, if you will, of that paragraph. So look, let's just go around the horn here. I mentioned distributed and the reasons why that's positive. But I want to also talk about the fact that as a recording or a data persist model, the DLT technologies not only are immutable, but they're time sequenced, right? Which, when you think about longitudinal integrity, it's a very important factor. So you cannot go back in time and change what happened, and you also capture in a chronological order, if you will, what has happened, leading to whatever outcome. Right? We started talking a few moments ago when it came to lung transplants. What led up to that person? Is that person dealing with distress or anxiety or other dependencies with regards to personality modification, narcotics, and so on, and all of those things lead up to certain outcomes, right? And then there's outliers around that concentrically, socioeconomic, SDOH, et cetera. So all of those data properties recorded longitudinally across distributed sources, right, without having to centralize them, are available on the ledger, which is very important when you're starting to train models and doing statistical analytics against those models. You also want to assure that as you're sharing the data, that the data are authentic, right? So when you're going forward in a scientific study, you really can't take a lot of missteps here, because going back in time and then rerunning the models or rerunning the analytics, are costly, and then also disturbs the progress with regards to the overall outcome that you're seeking to produce. So the DLT can assure through cryptographic science, data science, and other cryptology that the data are authentic, have not been changed, and remain such, so that you can go forward with a sense of trust, if you will. And then also from an identity perspective, and identity certainly relates to subject or patient in this case, but identity also would relate to a data model or an algorithm, a machine or a sensor, a wearable, a server, or a source or a database, right? So think about identity of being things, right? And that's one of the fundamentals of what's called the IoT, or the Internet of Things. So I'm going to take a few moments here to just go down some high level. Dr. Muhammad Ali has already seen some of this, so bear with me, Omar, please, for a few moments here while we reiterate. But I've chosen 4 key elements that I think might be of value to the research effort that we're seeking to kick off here. Collaboration, obviously, that's one I'll go into, but probably the most obvious. Trust, and impact, and extension, right? So just to peel back one layer of the onion here this morning, the more data you have, the more able you are to create actionable insights, things that really mean something, right? Again, going back to socioeconomic, environmental, right? We're going to do geofencing. We're going to understand air quality, other environmental factors, et cetera, et cetera. The more you can pull into this, and again, in a cost-effective and in a data science effective manner, the more you're going to be able to get some insights that are going to be helpful. And the trust factor here is key to this, right? Again, due to the nature of DLT, which are basically blocks of data that are interconnected through cryptographic networks that are encrypted and immutable, you wind up having a privacy and a trust protocol, if you will, that's allows for peer-to-peer sharing, organization to organization, scientist to scientist, et cetera, et cetera. And that opens up, if you will, a safe and secure data transfer opportunity, which is one of, if I recall, one of the 3 key aims of this entire study, right? To develop safe and secure data transfer between the cooperating institutions to improve the care and outcomes. So doing that over a trust protocol eliminates, if you will, a significant number of barriers. Certainly not everything, but certainly a number of barriers. And the way identity is handled, the individual's information is obfuscated, although we can identify that individual through other methods. And we can go into that if there are questions about that. But as we move down the road, I'm more than well equipped and very eager to share that detail. Probably not today, but the key here is for us to move forward in a collective way so that we can look at huge populations and then go into hyper-segmentation mode because of the decentralized nature of the DLT that we're persisting this data upon, right? And we can start to get down to very targeted subpopulations and understand the behavior patterns and other patterns that lead to positive or negatives, which we're seeking to prove one way or another in the study. And again, also, finally, in the extend mode, I added this because, hey, if we're going to go through all of this and use a new set of technologies, newer, if you will, to healthcare, or at least in this case, research and scientific studies, you really want to be able to reuse it. And there are huge numbers, especially as we start to go into extended modalities, utilizing remote monitoring, physiological and patient monitoring, and other models of care delivery and wellness management, right? So, and I'll give a couple of use cases at the end, just perhaps prime the pump here. But clearly, this is well targeted and well designed, if you will, for the RPM and other elements that we're seeking to deploy to achieve our goals together. So just very briefly, I'm offering for just, again, priming the pump, a couple of use cases, actually there's 3 ideas here. At the top here in this the diagram at the top, I've captured what was called areas of encouragement that are listed in the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation application document, right? Health Equity Team Science Award for what we're going after. And a couple of the things that came out to me, I thought were relevant to this particular part of our discussion this morning. Test new hypotheses, right? So decentralizing data, taking action where necessary, federating learning models, and in this case, suggesting computational medicine being deployed, right? Might fit the goal of testing new methods to move forward in this particular science project. I mentioned subpopulation isolations and the ability to easily, in a longitudinal fashion, in an immutable way, examine hyper-stratified segmentations of our populations and subjects that we're seeking to zero in on. This will allow us, in my experience, I've used this over the years, to understand outliers, and in some cases, outliers are the cause. As we have found in many cases, we've did a big thing with intubation-induced pneumonias and so on. And again, I could be more than glad to share details about that, but it was very interesting, a thermostat in an operating room. Anyway, so to the point earlier about environmental data being very relevant in our studies, I think that computational medicine and the deployment of such, which is effectuated by DLT, it can be a very large accelerator, if you will. The second new and advanced established model here or implementation is going into the computational sciences that I'm suggesting that we might consider here, right? So I gave a description of what they're defining here as advanced diagnostic analysis and analytics. Why did this event occur? So again, based on the integrity longitudinally of the pattern that have led up to this individual or this group of individuals or what have you, right? Why did this event occur? Well, why has home therapy not worked for a certain set of demographics or psychographics or socioeconomic defined individuals, or those that are breathing certain air? You never know, right? I mean, maybe the air is bad and home therapy. Anyway, the point is, why did this happen? And right, start to seek replications of that pattern, or understanding if that's something that can be extended across the entire exploration of other studies or populations. Finally, as a set of extensions, that fourth quadrant, if you will, I'm suggesting that we start to open this up because, again, of the trust factors and the ability to access information in a decentralized, secure, and transparent manner, the science of omics, right? The genome. And I know that in the many conversations and some of the documentation that I've read thus far, we start to talk about genetic mutations and other cause and effect, situations the DLT framework and the infrastructure that it affords, in my experience, I would assert to you, will enable and accelerate the use of this information in our determinations relative to what's actionable, what's an aha moment, so to speak, based on our research. And then finally, of course, as we start to talk about organ and tissue transplants, in this case, lung transplants, a big phenomenon. Just finally, somebody woke up and said, "Hey, across the country, it appears that others have measured, and in my experience at a number of academic institutions over the last 15 years, the tissue and lung and organ transplant program is broken. It's highly fragmented. It's very manual, and that does, unfortunately, have some bad effects, like long wait times and people die while they're waiting. And in this case, Dr. Muhammad Ali and others, he and I and others might be able to, start to generate, as an extension to this study, opportunities to create a kernel, if you will, of what might become used in a global program or a much more macro opportunity for improving what appears to be a broken program. At a high level, you got to understand that we're all about collaboration, and from a trust protocol perspective, that we believe we can make a huge impact by using the technologies, some computational sciences and data science to assure, one, that we've perhaps checked off the opportunities or the encouraged differentiation of our studies jointly through the use of DLT. And I know I went at a high level, and there's a huge amount of stuff behind all of this. I'd be more than glad to entertain a couple of questions now, or if it's more appropriate, in retrospect to today, Dr. Landon, has referenced my access and my information to reach me offline, so that we can drill down deeper if there's interest.
Thank you, Ted.
Very much, Dr. Landon. Appreciate the opportunity.
I didn't see anybody's head actually explode, so.
Yeah, I hope I don't have that effect, but
So I did want Rajoshi to show off some of the devices as well. Doug, does this make sense to you and Omar?
There's I would like to see some examples. I mean, there's a jargon issue.
Right.
I am learning a lot. You're dropping some keywords here that are very important to us. But I'd like to see how it's all tied together. Kind of like the work I do is just like leading after this gets implemented, the kind of data analysis. This is more of collecting the data, securing the data, ensuring security and access. Is that it's a platform?
Yes, sir. That's exactly right. Well, you definitely got it. So it is a platform. It's a set of tools. It is not a panacea. It's part of a number of components. But however, the unique nature of its technology and its architecture are exactly as you've said. They're accretive towards doing the things you just mentioned.
So the data analysis, this is putting the data together, right? The data, does it do the data analysis also?
No, sir. It is the substrate to allow that to happen without congregating the data together, which becomes a honeypot or.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
Like 80 or 90% of my job is just putting the damn spreadsheet together. It's just like, how do you deal with missing data and assessing the quality of the data and all this stuff? And it's like, if you don't, it's literally the data, the garbage in, garbage out type thing. So it's yeah. No, this looks quite exciting. I've not worked in this area before. How does it, have you, Chris, have you implemented this, or have you used this platform?
I have for tracking COVID vaccines.
Okay.
So getting a -80 sensor from Avnet and then putting the blockchain in place. So I would know if it sat on a tarmac in Uganda and ruined the vaccine. So that's been our implementation. We were asked by Neil Halpern who was our editor for the ICU, Irwin and Rippies. All right, Chris, you're far out there. Come up with something. So that's where Ted and I wrote the chapter in terms of that. It just also seemed to fit with what Rich's subcommittee is doing with and Omar keeps bringing up. Is this communication and finding that common communication between lung transplant centers so that we can do a better job. Dr. Swaminathan is my AI guy, and he's skiing now in Colorado. He said he'd stop in at the lodge and check in. So we work he's with Oxford University, and then we have an AI remote patient monitoring. They're very good at the algorithm portion of it.
Good.
And that's and Dr. Conrad, that's where the complementary element here would play into from DLT, and then the AI or the RPM components that the folks that Dr. Landon was just referring to. We together, it makes up the full package of being able to acquire, understand, and react to the data.
Have you so it sounds like you need access to the EHR for this platform, right? Some secure.
Well, it's according to what data elements we're looking for. The HL7 key messages from the HL7 streams, if that might come into might be enough. As opposed to direct access, but I think what we'll do is we start to go forward and understand the details of what's necessary for us to make progress in our research. Then I'll answer that question. But if that's the case, then that's not an issue either. It's not an issue technically.
Yeah.
Certainly from institutional ownership and other elements from a regulatory perspective, we'd have to obviously satisfy those hurdles. But from a trust perspective, everything would be anonymized.
Got it. Yeah. I'm just wondering from a practical point of view, these medical centers tend to, I'll put it nicely, value their security issues, and they're loath to break down their little firewalls and have outside people gain access. And I was just wondering if you've had experiences along that line, or is everything we're going to do manually, create a program, download it, and then upload it type thing?
Yeah, no, I've had extensive experience with that at a number of academic medical centers and large networks, including Intermountain and Johns Hopkins and University of Chicago Medical Center. And
that's good.
Others, yes.
Yeah,
okay.
But Doug, that's why this education program with all the new words in it. This is really what I would see Ted presenting to the IT people from each institution. And it's going to take time. I don't see this as a quick flip of the switch.
Yeah, no, I don't know about yours, but our IT department is just underfunded. I mean, if we have funding, they'll, they love money, you give them money, they'll put a programmer on it and, prioritize it. But if it's an unfunded thing and with an underfunded IS department, it's a challenge for us. I don't know what USC is like or what you guys are doing, or it sounds really cool. Is how do you access the data? How do you access the platform?
So the normal human access or machine-to-machine access will still occur. This is lower down the stack. The only difference might be if we were to onboard patients and through human interaction, through an interface, like for example some of the applications coming from Dr. Landon's colleagues with the RPM folks. They may get authenticated, so they may say take a photo of yourself and do you have your driver's license or so on, so that we know who you are. Then that all gets cryptographically obscured, right, and taken away. But then we put a unique address on there.
Yeah,
that would be the only difference. Other than that, it's just a member of the tech stack to get all this stuff done.
Cool. No, it's very good.
Yeah, it gets broke. I look at this like it's like a mirror, and you hit a mirror with a rock, it breaks into shards. But putting those shards back together or different pieces of the shards is what's possible with this particular approach.
Yeah.
And I worked for 2 years on hitting one button. So those 84 pieces of data went from Cerner directly into the registry instead of my nurse having to transpose data and the like. And the CF Foundation at the end, I think, chose IQVIA, and I don't think they had any success with it. So I have a working model for that, but be that as it may.
That's good.
So Omar, you've heard this twice now. You have at least half the words in your vocabulary. And the other, if we restrict it to 30 patients first year, and not try and take how many patients do we have in Southern California? It's like eight between all the institutions.
Are we talking like UCSD? We have around 250 adults and probably 120, 130 peds.
So 370, and then let's say there's 300 Hispanic inner city, lower socioeconomic patients. Do you think out of the
I'm going to say
1,000 or 1,500 or whatever we have?
Yeah, I think our peds department, our peds program is like 30 or 40% Hispanic, and I'd have to look at ours. Yeah. I would expect 20 to 25%. Somewhere in there.
So I think it's a matter of climbing a mountain one step at a time. Certainly, and we could, start with my institution. It was an uphill battle, but we eventually got there. So, well, Rajoshi, do you mind just showing off some of your devices and then?
Yeah, of course. So I work primarily in the pulmonary space, so with a lot of asthma, COPD areas. But I think, so recently we worked with Dr. Landon on a grant for CF, and we've been sort of looking at both asthma, COPD, and CF population. And I thought I could share some of the results and technology that we have, just that now that we have some understanding of remote monitoring, what kind of platforms to use, I can get into what type of data to collect that can give us an idea of how the patient is doing at home. So I have a quick presentation that I can share. Hopefully I have access to share it.
Yep.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. A quick introduction about me. I'm from Cognita Labs and the Chief Scientific Officer there. And our roots are from Rice University, where we first started working in the pulmonary area. And all of our devices have been built from NIH, NSF, SBIR grants. Recently, we got an SBIR grant for CF to build an airway clearance device as well. But our focus today, I think I'm going to focus on some of the remote monitoring technologies on what do you measure that can give us a sense of how the patient is doing at home. Our primary focus has been on gaps in chronic respiratory management. Some of the key things has been, especially for asthma COPD, has been that a lot of patients aren't aware of the disease control at home. So often it leads to exacerbations, which were sudden. There were sudden symptoms onset, and that's because at least in that population, they don't generally perform regular lung function testing or other lung function measurement modalities at home that can give them a sense of their disease control. And the second major part has been the poor adherence to medication, but not just the adherence to inhaler usage, but also the technique of inhaler usage. So we all know, a lot of patients make mistakes using inhalers that leads to only maybe 10% of the medication reaching their lungs. But if we can correct that inhaler technique, it can be a more effective therapy, and therefore can improve not just adherence, but also the medication delivered. So these are two of the focus areas for us, and particularly when it comes to understanding disease control or the lung function, there are several ways that you could do this. So for example, you could measure physiological changes by having a spirometry given to patients at home, or other other such as the lung function measurement methods such as oscillometry. But you could also opt for simpler methods such as pulse ox that can give us oxygen information. Or these days there are a lot of focus on wearables and respiratory rate monitoring. But to my understanding, those are often measurements of symptoms. So if the respiratory rate is down, it's a measurement of symptom. Pulse ox would probably happen a little earlier because the symptoms start appearing after the physiology has already started deteriorating. So our goal is, what if we want to detect exacerbation, or if we want to detect lung function decline early, we want to measure the physiological changes, not the oxygen level or the symptoms that happen late. So our challenge with home monitoring is that if we want to intervene early and if you want to detect those episodes, we want to have a sensitive measurement. We want to have a sensitive measurement of physiology. So our options would probably be limited to those which measure that airway physiology, particularly with CF, especially with, I think when you have a lot of mucus accumulation and inflammation in the airways, if we could measure early onset of that, it would be super helpful to intervene early. And then lastly, we also want it to be low effort, because we do know things like spirometry are very high effort tests. So it can often, be not possible for maybe children or elderly to do that type of test at home. So we're trying to converge into a solution that could measure sensitively early, but also something that anybody can do at home. So with that in mind, I want to introduce our Precision Care RPM platform, which primarily focuses on the lung function assessment that can measure airways, the medication assessment that not only measure medication, but also gives guidance on correct inhaler use, that is our talking inhaler, and then how you can grab the data to do remote analytics, for example, with what Ted just talked about, and be able to provide early intervention before an onset of an exacerbation. So that is our primary goal here. And I want to introduce oscillometry, in case I'm not sure how familiar you are with oscillometry, but it's actually a very old test, but it has been around for, I think, the past 5 decades or so. But the way it works is that you don't need forced breathing for airway measurement. All you do is simple tidal breathing, and it can measure your airway obstruction. So not only just airway, whether the airways are open or not, but also things like inflammation, because that makes airways inflamed and therefore increases the obstruction in it. And we have the first handheld oscillometry device called PulmoScan. It's FDA cleared, and it's currently being used as a remote monitoring tool in addition to just lung function assessment. So traditionally, oscillometry has been used as a lung function measurement in PFT labs, but it has never been, we've never been able to translate it into home monitoring, because even though it is sensitive to small airways, it has been a big tabletop machine. But now we have a handheld FOT device, which would be perfect for measuring the airways at home without requiring that forced breathing. To give you a little bit more context on how that works, is that this device, this particular airway testing method called oscillometry, it measures whether your airways have high resistance to airflow or low resistance to airflow. So it measures whether the airway resistance. Now, if it were for cystic fibrosis, in case of controlled patients, you probably would have low resistance to airflow. And but as the inflammation starts increasing and maybe the mucus builds up, the resistance increases, because the airways are getting narrower, and the test measures that directly. So it measures the airway mechanical properties, whether it is open or closed, which is why it is sensitive, because we're now trying to measure something that happens at the beginning of the exacerbation, like well before it has gone to exacerbation of symptoms. So this is where I think, even though we're using it currently for asthma and COPD, it could translate really well for cystic fibrosis. And a little bit more about the test. The way it measures is it sends out some pressure impulses into the airways, and then if the airways are open, then there'll be low resistance for that airflow to happen. But if not, then there'll be change in your measurements that can give you an idea of whether the patient has high resistance or low resistance. And the test can be done with simple breathing. So you just breathe it in and out while the device does all of the work. So children as young as 4-year-olds can do it very reliably. You're not going to be teaching them to do any forced exhalation like the spirometry, which is why I think it's more applicable for the remote monitoring or home monitoring cases. In fact, we have currently a COPD study that's going on with Dr. Landon at Ventura and also in UMass, where we have patients just doing this test at home without supervision, but we get very high quality data because it's not effort dependent. I have it in my hand. It's like this. It's a handheld FOT device, and you just breathe in and out for about 30 seconds, and it measures your air resistance.
Can I ask a question about that? So I've been looking into Asa. What's the price point of the portable one?
It's about 6,400, but the cost of remote monitoring model is very different because the reimbursements are different. So that's like a monthly model. But if you wanted to buy it for the clinic, that would be $6,400.
And does this allow you, because I know some of the more expensive models allow you to determine where the changes in the resistances are. We talking, because it like measures total air, system resistance minus the conducting airways and the differences in the small airways. Does this model do the same thing?
Yes. I was just going to get to that here in this slide. So there are two parameters. No, that's fine. So it measures not only the total lung resistance, but also small airway resistance. And that's where it becomes really crucial for small airway diseases like COPD. The way it does is, as I had mentioned a little bit before here, it sends some pressure, sinusoidal pressure waves into the lungs, and different frequencies work differently in our lungs. So for example, low frequencies, they reach all the way down to our lower airways, so peripheral airways, alveoli. So if you, for example, have emphysema or something, then that would your small airways and alveoli, and the low frequency measurements affect that. So you would have elevation in your measurements in the low frequency parts, while the mid frequency ones, for example, 20 hertz information, that gives you more about like the central airway. So eventually the data that you would get, it's something like this, where you have resistance on the y-axis and frequency on the x-axis. And that resistance will change depending on where you have the inflammation. So if you had inflammation in the peripheral airways, then your resistance in the low frequency range would elevate. So that 5 hertz one would become higher. Versus if you had, say, the central airway obstruction more, then it would be more flat because there isn't a specific elevation in the 5 hertz area. So that's more like a raw data that you would see, but then we derive parameters for it from this graph to show what is the small airway resistance, total airway resistance, and that can give you a better understanding of what happens for, say, COPD patients. So your small airway resistance might be super high compared to normal range, and while the rest of it might be okay. But for an asthma patient, you might just have elevated resistance, but it's not particularly high in the small airway parts. So that gives us very, I would say, disease specific or lung area specific information, where the resistance is high or where the obstruction is high. But not just the resistance, it also gives us information about the elasticity. So, for example, with COPD, when you have high inflammation or your lungs are filled with fluid, or even with cystic fibrosis, when you have a lot of mucus built up, the airways will become not as flexible when you're breathing in and out. So that flexibility or expandability is measured by reactants, and the same device can give you both types of information, not just the airway narrowing, but also the expandability. And that makes it super sensitive to early exacerbation detection. Just like I was mentioning before, we have different frequencies that go through. So the 5 hertz goes all the way to the lower airways, 20 hertz goes to the central airways, and that gives you specific information for where the obstruction is localized. And the elasticity part, the reactance part, gives you information whether, like lungs are springs, whether it's healthy airways, which are very springy airways, or there's stiffness in the airways. So it could be different disease cases. So that's where you might have elevation in those parameters. So that's just sort of like a summary of what it measures and why it is sensitive. But to give you some context, and so that was one of the first portion of our platform.
Before you go on, I have some questions about this. The digital output from your machine, is it digitalized, or is it just
Yes.
you get a number? It's a digital output that you download. Do you what is the retest capabilities of this? What's the technical variation of this measurement? So if I take the same person,
Right.
and measure them, 3 or 4 times an hour apart from each other, what does that look like? How is this different? The FEF 2575 is a really controversial thing here, and it has some value, I think, if you're following a person longitudinally, but at cross-sectional, the variation is, the normal variation is so wide, it's almost useless. I'm going to stick my neck out because I know a lot of pulmonologists will just love that number. But give me an idea of this variability of what normal looks like. I heard it's more variable.
Yes, you're very right to point that part out, because anything that becomes more sensitive usually has higher variability. So that's where the challenge happens. ERS has specific guidelines on what the variability of the measurement should be when it's considered a good test. And for oscillometry measurements, they have variability guidelines of 10%, under 10% for adults and under 15% for children. So if you've done 3 measurements, the variability between that should be within 10%. And for adults, for children, that could be less than 15%. Usually what we see in the measurements in patient population is about 5%. I would say, and the sensitivity is such that, so just to give a sense, again, give an idea, for example, when you have bronchodilator response, how that varies versus the individual measurement variability. So in this case, the bronchodilator change is supposed to be 40%. So if you have 10% variability of resistance, that's the highest variability, the changes you're looking at is 40% change, which is why it's highly sensitive, but the margin of variability is about 10%, to give you a sense.
Do you have a sense of, okay, so that's the technical variability you're talking about. How about the, I don't know, minimally clinically important difference?
Right. So for that, there are several reference equations that give you a sense of what is your healthy population data versus what is the disease population data. So what we do in our software is that once the data is captured, it is compared against a healthy population number. So if you think of it as a histogram, your mean is your healthy population data. And if your resistance is elevated, then it'd be high resistance, versus if your resistance is lower than the mean, then that's great. That means you're very healthy. And the cutoffs are at similar to the spirometry, where you have 1.6 times the sigma, your upper and lower bounds, so that's similar for oscillometry measurements itself. But in this case, obviously, if your resistance is more than 1.6 sigma, the standard deviation, then that's considered elevated. So that's usually the, yeah.
Maybe I should talk a little bit offline, but I'm just writing a paper on the racial disparities in lung function studies. And so your models of what normal are, what do they, what's the input? Are you using age, gender, height, or what?
Yes.
Age, and you're using race?
Yes, yes. There
are racial differences in oscillometry measurements.
Yes. Yes, while most of the devices currently do use a standardized reference equation, the research in this area has been really accelerating in the last 10 years. So we now have reference equations from different ethnic groups as well. So for example, we have one from Mexican children, but that was done in Mexico. So the children in Mexico, not the Hispanic population in the US. But we have an equation for them. Then we have two equations for South Asian population. There are several equations for Chinese population. And as more of these papers come out, you can just add those reference equation as a software change, because it's literally just comparing the measurements with that reference value. But yeah, it definitely helps you get a sense of how far these numbers are from what you would consider normal, and be able to gauge whether they have that elevation and the bronchodilator response. So how it drops because of the bronchodilator.
Rajoshi, I'm going to volunteer your time to drive from UC Irvine to UC San Diego and meet with Dr. Conrad.
Yeah,
and bring a device with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. I mean, I live in OC, so I can pretty much go Ventura, San Diego. I go to San Diego all the time anyway. So it would be absolutely wonderful to just give you a device, have you test it out, see what, discuss the
okay.
Can I ask a quick question? How was this device used in any of the TRICAFTA studies, FEV1?
No.
Probably not. Yeah,
No.
probably not.
No, just
FEV1. This is where I'm going, because I'm doing this is related. I'm phage therapy trial, and this is where I'm thinking the FDA, as far as I know, has not used oscillometry as an outcome measure, a physiological. They're stuck with FEV1s, which is a major airway measure.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I might take you up on inviting you down for a conversation. So
that'd be wonderful. That'd be wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think we've because I think oscillometry hasn't been a standard of care as such. I think that's why a lot of the times they do stick to FEV1, but in my understanding, it is way more sensitive and underutilized, which hopefully can change, especially not just in CF. I mean, with COPD, we recently showed that with Dr. Landon in one of the studies that we could detect exacerbation 7 days early, which is like huge amount of window where you can provide intervention, potentially even avoid the exacerbation. So I'm going to present that data just right after the other device, but that could happen for CF as well, where you can detect these exacerbations early, identify the high risk patients with this test. So yeah, I'm going to move to the next device, which is about medication usage. So this was about monitoring lung function. And the next part for us is also to be able to measure medication usage, whether the patients are using the inhaler regularly, but also what is the inhaler technique? Are they able to use their inhalers properly or not? And for that, we have our talking inhaler, it's CapMedic. I have a little demo here as well. So this is the little cap, and it goes on top of your regular meter dose inhalers, and it actually talks to us. Shake your inhaler as needed. It says shake your inhaler. It has these lights, and it helps you use the inhaler properly. So it's a very interactive coaching little guide that talks, but also monitors whether they're using it properly or not. And I'm gonna just do a quick breathing. It'll give me musical feedback to help me breathe and inhale for a long duration. So I followed the music, and it got me a reminder as well to hold my breath. And at the end, it tells me I did really well. I got all 4 green lights. That means everything is good. So it gives patients some feedback that they're using their inhalers properly. And I mean, often we just find that patients are given a prescription of the inhaler, and they may be trained in office, or they may be trained by the pharmacist, but they go home and they forget. But this tool helps them remember every time they use the inhaler, what is the right step, and also gives some feedback back to the physician that, okay, hey, out of my 100 patients, these are the 5 who just keep getting it wrong, and here's how we can improve the inhaler technique for those. And it's an FDA-cleared device, and we did a study with Dr. Landon in the Pediatric Diagnostics Center, where we gave this device to about 23 patients, and had them use the inhaler just without any feedback, so we can measure their baseline inhaler technique, which is very poor, about 1 out of 4 correct steps. And then we showed them a video that showed how to use the inhaler properly. That didn't help much either. But then when you give an interactive device that they work with, that gives them coaching for every step of the way, that improved the inhaler technique by 3x. So yeah, so we presented that in ATS, that's 2020. But now we have incorporated this as part of a remote monitoring platform, where you give this device to the patient. They can put it on their rescue inhaler, they can put it on their regular control medications, but it can give physicians a peace of mind in that these are the patients who've been regularly using the inhaler and correctly using the inhaler. So likely they're getting the effective amount of dosage that they should. And even if after that their lung function is declining, then you know that medication is probably not the issue, it's something else. So it helps you get a sense that what is the medication usage by the patient. And the same device also becomes an FEV monitor. So it's a 2-in-1 device, because for some patients, say, for whom oscillometry may not be feasible, FEV1 can still work. So what we do is just take this inhaler out and put this little mouthpiece in, and now it becomes a spirometer. All you do is just blow into this device, and it gives traffic light assessment of how well their lung function is. So I can just do a quick one. And it gives me, but I didn't put full effort, so it gave me a red light. But if I put full effort, and it will show me green or yellow based on where my lung function is. But as you can see in the graph, it can give you a sense of how their lung function is changing over time. And I'll show you an RPM case as well, where we detected low FEV1, provided prednisone, all through remote monitoring, and then we're able to improve their lung function over time. So that's another method that we could use for those where FEV1 monitoring could be appropriate. But that gives you lung function monitoring as well. So just wanted to throw some of the recent literature out there on point of care using oscillometry that has shown early detection of exacerbation. This is in COPD and asthma space, but I feel that similar would be seen in CF, just because of the nature of how airway changes for CF. Zimmerman paper was, I think it came out in 2020, that showed 3-day early exacerbation of COPD. And the current study that we are running is very similar to that. So here's just a snapshot of our ongoing COPD study. What we do is we are monitoring high-risk COPD patients. So these are who have like frequent exacerbations at least once a year, and then we're monitoring for 6 months by giving them this oscillometry device at home. So every day they just take a couple of readings and just breathe in and out for 30 seconds. And we're also monitoring their inhaler use, their rescue inhaler use. And then we have a text message-based system to ask about their symptoms, which is our ground truth, whether the symptoms are exacerbating or not. And that's through the standard CAT questionnaire. So till now, we've recorded about 15 moderate to severe ACOPD events, the exacerbation events, and about 12 mild exacerbation events. But our early analysis showed that we could, the trends in the oscillometry data start increasing about 7 days before the exacerbation event. To give you an idea of what that means, here is on the top, you have one of the parameters from the oscillometry data. On the bottom, we have how symptoms change. And you can see that there is a window of about 7 to 10 days where the oscillometry data has increased because the airway changes happened before, and then the exacerbation happened. So that gives you that window of intervention. And we saw that similar trends in all the patients that had exacerbations. So here's one which had 3 exacerbations in our monitoring time. And every time the oscillometry data would increase right before the exacerbation. So you could get that window to give them some medication or a different interventional treatment. That could potentially have avoided it, but this was an observational only study. So we were just observing whether that led to an exacerbation or not, but symptoms wasn't that clear an indication, or sometimes would happen late. And this was the results that just got accepted in ATS, where we show that the exacerbation could be detected about 5 to 7 days early. So, so I think I don't want to overload everybody with a lot of information, but the takeaway here is mainly that oscillometry gives us very sensitive information because now it's easy to do by patient. You could do it remote monitoring. You could include it in remote monitoring, and it's sensitive and and can be done by children. So for cystic fibrosis could be a possible way of measuring the lung function. But also then we can measure their medication usage with the inhaler, the smart inhaler. And I want to show a couple of data points there. So I'm just going to skip over this. But let's see. So this is the platform that you have at the end, where you have the lung function coming from the oscillometry, medication coming from the inhaler, and all coming together in the risk prediction platform. And here is some of the data I wanted to share with you. So when it comes to FEV1 tracking, these are some of the remote monitoring that we're doing commercially, but here you have lung function dropping, which was detected by the device. Which are those 2 red circles. And this is for an asthma patient where once the second drop in lung function was detected, the physician decided to prescribe them prednisone. You could see the sharp increase in their lung function right after. So it's great monitoring tool for even post-treatment cases. So whether the patient is doing well with the new intervention, and then be able to monitor the recovery. And then similarly for medication usage, you can track which patients are using inhalers properly, or if they have poor inhaler technique, can you provide them training? And then you see that inhaler technique improvement as well. So I'm going to stop it at this point, because we have some idea of what the devices are. But I think with a platform like TEDS, you could just include everything together and then be able to do far more richer analytics with that sensitive data.
Okay.
Very good.
So we want to bring this back to the adherence. I think for Omar and Doug, that we do have this is a good device in terms of adherence. I think there's the part of our problem with people who have transportation difficulties. This allows us to look into their home, demonstrate that they are adherent, and also to intervene more quickly, particularly for our Hispanic patients who do not have access to the CFTR correctors. We need to improve access to care and access to intervention. So that's how I saw this fitting in. So how would we?
I think it's great.
Good,
Honestly. I think I don't know that much. I'm learning about oscillometry, but I think it's got a lot of advantages over the FEV1, which is a very effort dependent type thing.
Well, Rajoshi was very good, and she's really made it simple enough for even me to understand. So I think getting it down to red, yellow, green, but also some very short educational aspects to it. It's been very helpful. So AP.
I think Jacob is trying to get back on, Chris.
Participants. There we go. All right, so we can stop talking about Jacob now. Good.
Thanks for letting me back in.
Yeah, well, and I recorded it so that